Okay, so the recording's live. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to have a great webinar by Somia Sadiq. And I will allow introductions in just a couple minutes here. We do have a poll running that if you have not filled in yet, please do. We'd like to know what your role is in this process of the mining industry. We are also going to do a little bit of an engagement experiment today. So we'll be using a function of Zoom that's called breakouts. And it's kind of like having little round table discussions. So we'll put you into randomly assorted groups of say about 5 people. And we'll give you each a minute to talk about the question we're going to throw at you. And what we'll ask, because we have so many attendees on and we'll have so many breakouts, is rather than have everyone report out, we'll get you to use the chat room to sort of type up a little mini summary of your discussion, and everybody will be able to see that, and we'll either get maybe a couple people to speak up, or maybe Somia can just summarize a couple things or pick out a couple key points she sees there. I'm just going to close the poll so you can see the results here. And hopefully you can see that now. Yes, thumbs up. Perfect. Okay, and then I guess we can start with introductions. So Edith, go ahead.
Thank you, but I don't see the poll. How do
you don't see the poll?
No, I don't see it. Am I the only one not seeing it?
Can others see it?
I saw it.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's telling me that.
That's fine. I see it now. Thank you.
Okay. Do we want to leave that up right now, or?
Yeah, that's fine.
To take it down.
That's fine. Thank you. The reason why, have you explained why we're doing that?
No, we were just curious. Somia was curious about who we had on the line today, and we hadn't any other way to find that out. So we thought we'd try out the poll.
Okay, so welcome everybody. My name is Edith Garneau. Donc mon nom est Edith Garneau. I'm the chair of the Environmental and Social Responsibility Society with CIM. And Karen Chauvin, the one that was talking before me, will be the next chair. Starting in May, and I'm saying that because and the polling that we're trying today is because we have our annual general meeting on May 4th. Even if there's no CIM convention, we will hold our AGM May 4th. You probably receive a newsletter, ESRS newsletter about it, and I will encourage all of you to be to come to this AGM. It will be on Zoom. And that's why we're trying the poll, because we will have elections and we have amendments to the charter of ESRS. So I will encourage all of you, if you have any questions, look at the newsletter. And if you didn't receive it, please let us know. ESRS.org, I think. Is it CIM/ESRS?
I'll put it in the chat, but it's ESRS@CIM.org.
Thank you.
So you can send a note. Whether you think you're on the list already and you didn't receive an email, or whether you'd like to join our membership, let us know.
And we have some elections as well for positions within the executive or with working groups. And we're looking also for some leaders and members of working groups, different working groups related to topics of environment issues and social responsibility issues, as well as Indigenous issues. And we also have an Indigenous working group, which could be of interest for today. So I will introduce, I won't introduce a biography of Somia Sadiq, but I had the chance to read a paper regarding the same topic. And I was very, very impressed of seeing such a large and broad issue coming from different perspectives and regions as well in Canada. So thank you very much. So Somia, the floor is yours, or the screen is yours.
Okay, so Karen, would I be able to share the presentation now?
Yeah, you should be able to share from the base of the screen. And I'll just put a reminder, can everybody who is not speaking now mute themselves? So we have no
already.
background noise.
Okay, I'm just gonna try doing this. Give me 1 second here. Can everyone see the first slide that says free, prior, informed consent?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yes.
Okay, awesome. So good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for being here. It occurred to me yesterday that it is Good Friday today, and very interesting time. So thank you for making time. And I asked Karen for the millionth time, are you sure the webinar is still on, just given the number of cancellations around the country? So it's been really interesting, and I hope you're all staying safe and your families are staying safe. Very interesting times. For me personally, what has been noteworthy with these video conferences is I'm much more self-aware of my facial expressions, and I realized recently just how much I scowl in social settings. So I've been working on that a lot. So if you find me smiling to a creepy level, that's probably why. I'm likely overcompensating for the permanent scowl on my face. So my name is Somia Sadiq. As mentioned, the meaning of my name is the type of resilience that comes from fasting. My origin is half Punjabi, half Kashmiri. I have 3 beautiful children, one of whom tried to convince us to get a chicken yesterday. She hasn't been successful yet, but she's working on us. So we'll see who survives this one. I am in a professional setting. I'm the founder and partner at Narratives. It's a consulting practice that I founded 3 years ago. We mainly focus on impact assessment and Indigenous engagement. I am practicing social distancing and very much grateful for the privilege of being able to do so. So I hope you're all also following the advice of our public health officials. So the reason that we wanted to do the poll, I guess, from my perspective, was I like to know who my audience is, as I'm sure you all do. And especially in the context of a video conference, this was kind of the only way we could figure that out. So thank you for providing your insight. We've got a nice spread of people, backgrounds. I see that a majority of the people in the room, 57%, are practitioners with a technical background, legal, scientific. We have another 29% practitioners in the engagement, social perspectives. We also have industry owners, we have Indigenous representatives, as well as government officials. So thank you all for being here. So the presentation, I only have 15 slides, so it's not going to be too terribly tedious. But this is based on some research that I did over a period of about 5 years. And where it started from was years ago, I was advising one of my industry clients, and we were sitting around in the boardroom, and I had just joined the team, and we received this letter from one of the Indigenous nations in the areas that my client was operating in. And the letter said that this is an eviction notice. You do not have our free, prior, and informed consent. And we looked around at each other and looked at this letter and said, okay, well, what does this mean? And in the room, we had 2 biologists, we had a lawyer, we have three representatives from the industry, we had planners, and we had a couple of engineers. And I said, okay, let's go around the room and ask people what what they think this letter means. And it was fascinating. We had 17 different responses. And that's what initiated the research that I'll talk about a little bit today. So in terms of the outline of the presentation, before I share the results of my research, Karen brought up this great idea of running this experiment today. So again, recognizing that this is an experiment, so it might lead to some frustration, but please work with us. We'd like to know what you think from your perspective is the definition of FPIC. I'll then talk about what I heard during the course of my research. I'll quickly touch upon FPIC and my read of the Wet'suwet'en episodes, I guess, that have evolved. I like to call it a crisis. And just high level, what are the implications for industry? So that's the general outline. So before we go any further, I think this would be that point where we do a breakout, Karen, on what FPIC means to people.
Sorry, I'll take myself off mute. So the breakout rooms have been set up. There are about 5 or 6 people per room. Somia, it is pushing you into a room, so you can just leave the room if you choose or not accept to move into the room. If anybody has questions while they're in the room, you can put a note in the chat or invite the host to join you. So I think the only person signed on as host right now, so I could try and help sort anything out if there's questions. The chat, just to, if anybody has not opened it, I will be sending you to the rooms in just a minute, but the chat, if you go to the bottom of your screen, there's a panel there where you can unmute yourself, turn your video on, open the chat box, and find all those things there, okay? And you can leave the room at any point in time if you feel the need, and what it'll do is just bring you back to this main room. So I'm going to put you in there for about 5 minutes. We'll give, say, up around a minute for each of you to sort of chit chat and say something, and then you'll get a warning when you'll be brought back to this room. I think we can give you 30 seconds or a minute to wrap things up and type your stuff into the chat from your discussion, and then we'll see you back here all at once. So I think I may need to get you to unshare your screen, but the question is, what does FPIC mean to you? So that's what we want you to talk about. Okay, so I'm going to send you off. Just give me 1 second, 5 minutes, countdown, 60 seconds. Okay, open all rooms. We should see an invite to join a room. For those of you who haven't joined yet, you should have an invite to accept.
Not yet, Karen. I know it's working because everyone's disappearing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm looking at every corner. I've got a small laptop, so maybe it's just hidden in one corner.
Sorry, let me see.
What side of the screen did it pop in? See, recording.
It should have just come into the
right in the middle.
view.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Normally that's what I get in Zoom, but I'm not getting it now. So.
This is our first. Oh, here we go. Assign to. Let's put you in breakout 1. For some you weren't assigned.
Oh yeah, there it goes. Okay, I'll see you later.
Bye. Breakout 4 needs some people. Let's do this. Okay, I think everybody should be assigned. Oh, it looks like there's something going on with folks who have called in. So maybe some of you here have not gotten an invite, you're called in. If that is you, maybe unmute yourselves and just chit chat with us here in the main room. So I see a Patrick, a Eugene, Ninad, Alan, and oh, maybe that's the only 4. Are you there? Hello?
Either their lines are muted.
Yeah, well, they should be able to unmute themselves, but I think because I'm managing the breakout rooms, I don't have that power right now. So this will be interesting to see how this works. You know, I only gave them 5 minutes, so some of them joining quite late, they may not get a lot of time to chat, but.
So is the idea that they would enter the results in this main screen, the chat on the side?
In the chat, yeah, okay. They should be able to see. It should be the same chat in every room.
I see, okay.
At least that's how it worked the last time I used it. So okay. We should start seeing things. Oh.
The first 2 minutes of a breakout room are always so awkward though. Like, oh, who's...
It is, but the one thing I'll say is when I was first thrown into it, because you're in such a small group and everybody's thrown into it, you just start talking. So
yeah.
Sorry, I'm trying to respond because Ninad has an issue here. Oh, maybe I cannot.
I think they left actually.
Yeah, she's having problems with audio. She couldn't hear anything. So he, Ninad, it's hard to tell. Well, I suppose I should have paused the recording, but it's okay.
Good. So has the convention been moved to next year?
They're looking at everything to be held virtually. So they offered every speaker to do a webinar.
Right.
And also they otherwise asked, so if they get a block of lists as it had been organized previously, so say 4 speakers in one session, they will maybe organize the session as a whole instead of individual.
Right.
Which is my preference because that's how we set it up. And then we could have a moderator and everything, so.
Right.
But that's all being designed and whatnot right now. A lot of speakers actually are declining the offer to do webinars, which I find surprising, but we'll see.
Yeah, we had, I was supposed to speak at a conference in Spain, in Sevilla, in May actually, and they considered briefly to do an online webinar-based conference, and most people declined. A huge attraction, of course, in that case was the ability to go to Spain, and so I think it was going to be a challenging decision for the conference organizers. So they ended up postponing theirs to next year at the same time.
Yeah. I see a lot of them being postponed till September, October, November, but like to postpone and make all the arrangements and not know if we can actually come back, it's difficult, I think.
For sure. Yeah, and a lot of the organization has to be done in advance, like ordering materials and sponsorship packages and whatnot. So I appreciate the challenge.
All right, so people have been given a minute to come back. So I hope that I was right that the chat's the same in every place, so people aren't typing twice, but we'll find out.
Right.
All right, everybody's coming back.
Oops.
Everybody's back.
whether
All
you
of
were
a
ready or
sudden.
not.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, surprise.
Right, yeah.
So
You didn't consult us there, Karen. You just pushed it back. Did you do that as an example, perhaps?
well, I wasn't in any of the rooms to know how the discussion
okay.
was going, but at the same time, I do know how it does force you to come back and wrap up quickly.
Yeah.
And it is an experiment. We just wanted to try 5 minutes to see, what do people think of that? Can anyone want to speak up and just, what did you think about that exercise of doing little round tables?
Not enough time.
Okay.
Barely got through introductions and we were done.
Yeah.
Okay.
Part of it is it took everyone a couple minutes just to get unmuted.
Right.
Right.
So
Okay,
the
so
in the
training,
future,
it will work.
good feedback.
In the future, the first breakout room should be given an extra couple minutes.
Yes, good point. So next time we'll do a little round of introductions, test it, and then maybe do the question the next time. Okay.
Maybe one suggestion that would help is if for each breakout room you assign sort of a coordinator that takes care of the process flow.
Yes. We would do that for designed workshops for sure. This was just an idea first thing this morning, so it wasn't really planned. I don't see any notes in the chat, so if anybody does want to add some thoughts about, what you did get, some points that came up, if you did get to that point, please do enter it in the chat so we can all see that. And we'll maybe let Somia just carry on for now.
Okay.
You have to share your screen again.
Right. Let's see. How do I?
Thank you for participating, everyone.
Thank you.
There we go.
Okay.
Perfect. Okay, and please remute yourselves again, everyone.
Okay, so so a quick background on free prior informed consent. For most of you, this is not new information, but I like to bring everybody back in time and sort of more build the narrative around the fact that free prior informed consent is not a new concept. This is not the first time we're hearing it. So it was originally introduced by the ILO in 1989, and it was done so in an effort to protect the rights of Indigenous people subjected to involuntary displacement. Note that at the time, Canada did not ratify the ILO Convention. 2007, ILO Convention 169 paved the way for UNDRIP, which then broadened the principle of free prior informed consent from what it was previously to also include a broader range of development activities. So the right to redress for territories adversely affected, a commitment by the state to seek the free, prior, and informed consent before projects were approved. At the time, Canada did not endorse this. 2010, Canada did endorse the document as, or the UNDRIP as an aspirational document. In 2014, conversation about veto took the front seat, and Canada rejected the idea that consent meant veto. 2015, two major things happened. TRC issued its calls to action, the 94 calls to action that I'm sure most people are very familiar with, hopefully by now. And in these calls to action, there was the recommendation to also implement UNDRIP, in particular, obtaining the free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous people before proceeding with economic development projects. Now, the Trudeau government then committed to implementing UNDRIP. 2016, Bill C-262 was tabled, passed in the House of Commons, but then died in June of 2018. 2019, Bill 41 passed in BC, and this is essentially the first piece of legislation locally in Canada that enshrined UNDRIP into law. So what I'd like to talk about in the next in the next few slides is the results. I'll present the results of the research. So like I mentioned, the research was done over a period of 4 years. I interviewed practitioners, I introduced Indigenous leaders, community members, elders. I interviewed industry representatives, as well as associations such as the Mining Association of Canada, ICMM, and so on. So there were quite a few opinions expressed during the course of the research. But going back to what originally inspired the research, that idea that FPIC meant different things to different people was kind of what came out of the research. So here are the results for free. So free to participants represented a freedom to make decisions, freedom to freely express their views, freedom to exercise control over Indigenous territories, absence of coercion, having sufficient time to engage. And you'll start seeing some very interesting things here where the idea of having time to engage or sufficient time to engage, you would think would be more associated with the prior component of FPIC. But you'll start seeing a lot of overlap in the meanings of the different pieces of FPIC. Free also represented consideration of past issues. Free represented an ability to understand what it was that was being consented to. And free meant consistency with Indigenous people's own participatory methods. And I'll talk a fair bit about this one. But then what did prior mean? Prior meant before mining exploration, before development. So keep in mind that the results here have been combined in the sense that these represent the views of all the participants. So if depending on which background or you come from, you might be able to identify views that either you relate closely to or your peers who might be a different group relate to. So to give you an example here, before mineral exploration was definitely an opinion that was strongly expressed by Indigenous organizations and Indigenous leadership. Before development was a view that came forward quite a bit from regulators, for example. Before the first domino falls, and this one again came from Indigenous representatives, where they said prior means before decisions that cannot then be reversed or that results in additional decisions are made. Prior also represented giving communities sufficient time to understand the issues. Continually through the life of a project. So FPIC is not a one-time thing. Building consent is not a one-time thing. On that note, we did have concerns from industry about talking too early, and which in industry's mind would raise the expectations to a point where they wouldn't be able to manage those expectations, or too early in the sense that they didn't even know what it was that they should be talking about. Next, the results related to informed. I selected that image for a very specific purpose, and I'll come to that after I get through this list here. So informed represented having the relevant information, having from a nation's perspective, a community's perspective, the capacity to be informed, building information together, so co-generation of knowledge, allowing for true learning. And this in particular meant learning for both parties, both Indigenous organizations, for Indigenous nations, as well as learning for industry, for regulators, essentially everybody who was involved in the mining process, informed in culturally appropriate ways, and on an ongoing basis. And again, this was something that had a strong overlap with the meaning of prior. Early and through all phases of the project, so whether that's pre-exploration, exploration, advanced exploration, development, decommissioning, and establishing what there is to talk about. And again, this was this came up quite a bit, in that the nations, as well as industry, would say, we can initiate conversations, but what it is that we're trying to talk about from a community's perspective, a nation's perspective, are they looking for information on partnerships? What are their interests? And are companies or governments able to even start speaking to those interests? So establishing the terms of the discussions was a really important component identified for FPIC, or for Informed in particular. Now, the reason I selected that image on study was because a lot of the times when we're in the thick of a mining project, the focus of study is to inform. If you're a practitioner who's been hired by industry, the focus of Inform makes industry and the regulator your key audience. And I've been guilty of that myself. I've authored dozens of environmental impact statements, and the focus is the regulator needs to read this, they have to approve it. So it has to be written in a language and a tone that the regulators would be able to comprehend, understand, and make decisions. And so the discussions around Informed were really insightful in that they really highlighted the bias in how a mining project evolves, focused on industry representatives, the project manager who's overseeing the work of the consultant, if you will, as opposed to the nations who are involved in the broader issue of social acceptance for the project. So consent, of course, the most hotly discussed topic. The issues around consent focused on 4 main areas. Is consent veto? Is consent an agreement or an agreement of sorts? Who seeks consent? And then how to build it. And a lot of the narratives around FPIC focus on generally these 4 topics. I think the easiest ones to talk about end up being whether or not consent is veto and how do you build it. And we see a lot of that, how do you build it, through guidance documents and best practice advice through different organizations. And a lot of the organizations have been doing a really good job of putting out those materials. There is still a lot of discussion around who seeks it and what does it really even look like in practice. So here are the results from my research on what consent means. And none of these, for the record, spoiler alert, are going to be a surprise to you. So I'm sorry for the disappointment in advance. But here are some of the thoughts. So to some, consent was veto, and to others, it was not. No surprise there. Quite a few, actually, of the participants said that the whole discussion around whether or not it's veto is very distracting, and it takes away from the actual meaning of FPIC as a whole, which is process. So that I thought was very interesting. Quite a few of the participants said that at the end of the day, FPIC represents an agreement of some form. In terms of responsibility or who does it, a majority of the participants indicated that it was the responsibility of the Crown, not industry, though industry has to play a strong role in making sure the Crown understands the project itself, the impacts of the project, and the interests of both the industry and the nations. In terms of how, it kind of always came back to needing trust and respect, which again would be no surprise to those of you who work in that area. This was, again, no surprise, but quite insightful in that it is a multi-stage process. So having an impact benefit agreement signed does not mean that you have consent throughout the life of the project, or having an exploration agreement signed does not mean that you have consent for mine development. And I think this is, it's a hard one to understand, but a pretty logical one if you think about the different stages and how many players end up being involved in a typical mining process. So these are like high level, the results of what each of the words, free, prior, and informed consent, meant to the participants. I'd like to spend a couple of slides reflecting on Wet'suwet'en and consent. Now, qualifier or disclaimer rather here is I was not involved personally in advising any entity, any company or government that ended up being involved in what unfolded in Wet'suwet'en. So my views here are merely those of an outsider looking in. I've always been somewhat bothered by pure opinions with, on projects that I may have been involved in and may have some insight. So my advanced apologies to anyone who is closer or more deeply involved in the Wet'suwet'en issues. And if my understanding is very, very naive, please, I'd love to hear it from you. So my read of the conflict is that there seemed to be consent from Indian Act elected leadership. However, there was no consent from the Wet'suwet'en leadership, the 5 clans of 13 houses. Governments generally refused to get involved, and this applied to both BC representatives as well as federally, and I'm referring to the political representatives. Other administrative representatives, if you will, on the natural resources side, did seem to be involved. Unfortunately, what ended up happening and what made the news all across the country was what we saw as the hashtags Shut Down Canada, Wet'suwet'en Strong, All Eyes on Wet'suwet'en, and so on. And of course, we were all aware of the significant conflict between the land defenders and the RCMP. This did lead to strong consolidation of Indigenous movements across the country. Years ago, we saw the rising of Idle No More and several other organizations. And I think the Wet'suwet'en conflict definitely brought those organizations together yet again. And the outcome was that we had a chance to look at or see, sadly, a lot of the different fractures across the country. There was significant racist commentary based purely sometimes on inconvenience, because we did see shutdowns, we did see protests across the country. And in some cases, it came from simply a place of naivety, in other cases, ignorance, and in other cases, sadly, pure racism as well. So ultimately, a lot happened, and I think a lot will continue to happen post-COVID. And even during the COVID pandemic, we're continuing to hear the construction efforts by CGL, or construction efforts on CGL. And I think that's continuing to highlight some of the issues around FPIC as we go along. Just some images from what came out of what was happening. So I think this is my last or second last slide, but I just wanted to quickly speak to implications for industry against the backdrop of Wet'suwet'en. So FPIC is one of those things that gets highlighted when something goes wrong. And that's not just about FPIC. I think it's the nature of engagement practice. It's the nature of anyone who works in the area of social responsibility or building, social license to operate or risk communications. Things are only noted when they go wrong, and which is an unfortunate reality. But no news is good news in that when things go wrong, we get a good chance to reflect on how they went wrong and how we could have done them better. So the Wet'suwet'en crisis, I think, has highlighted some very interesting implications for industry, naturally for the oil and gas industry, but as a result also for other industries who I think should be watching closely and learning, if you will. So I think it's fair to say that there is a global shift in priorities. And I have shift in quotes here because that shift is different for different people. That said, we've seen strong emphasis on Indigenous rights, rightly so. We've seen a strong emphasis on pushing for issues around climate change and global warming, which I think is training this next generation of practitioners and essentially changing that mindset on what is important. And it'll be really interesting also coming out of COVID to see how that shift either progresses or is redefined as we move forward. So I think it's important for industry to be mindful of that shift in priorities. There still continues to be, unfortunately, this fearful narrative of uncertainty around consent. Now, I should say that this varies throughout Canada. Some provinces have taken a more certain role about, yes, if we do things better, if we have better discussions, if we work closely with Indigenous partners, that we'll do better. In other cases, we've seen leadership in other provinces, Manitoba, unfortunately, being an example, where we have heard political leadership saying that UNDRIP is a bad idea, it just introduces uncertainty and so on. So the diversity of that narrative around the country, I think, has some strong implications both for industry as well as all the different players involved. Another implication for industry, which is not new, it's something that's been, I think, one of the challenges from my perspective for industry is the turnover between exploration to development, which makes it really difficult to build those long-term relationships with nations in the areas that industry operates in. And to me, there really does need to be a mechanism for continuity in some fashion. And I think if we reflect on the idea of broader consent building, broader relationship building, then there might be some ways that this can be improved. This is really sad for me because I am an impact assessment practitioner, but I have seen the sad decline of the standard of practice, despite there being a strong narrative around improving the practice. It pains me to see how linear environmental assessment practice has become over the years, when it really should be very multidisciplinary, very broad-based, very network-based. Everything is tied to each other based in respect for Indigenous rights. So I won't say more about that because I could write a book on it. CSR and FPIC, we did see quite a strong narrative around corporate social responsibility and FPIC, which was really good to see at one point. Unfortunately, what happened, and I think that still continues to happen based on my observations, is that CSR is one department within organizations which may or may not be involved in project-based consent building. So I think there needs to be a critical, or if CSR and FPIC continue to be two separate things within organizations, I think that can stay problematic. One other strong consideration for industry is that industry is dealing with an informed audience. We have people, we have nations who are much more informed about their rights and understand the implications of their rights not being respected and have built strong allies across the country. So I think industry can be rest assured that they are dealing with an informed audience. This is no surprise, there's far more accountability because of social media. We've seen the ability of groups to organize, groups to mobilize really quickly and cause a significant amount of disruption by minimal, very quickly. So I think for industry, that is an important consideration. All that aside, here are some very, very candid thoughts on the way forward. I mean no offense by these are just very strong reflections, if you will. So I'm tired of hearing how, you know, how do you build FPIC? How do we do this? Just do it is my answer. It's not rocket science. It's about respect. It's about building relationships and getting to know people. And so, you know, while I really, really do appreciate the guidelines and the best practice principles and so on, there are so many of those out there. And if as a practitioner we picked up 10, read them all, we know how to do it. Just need to start doing it. This one and the next one are more, I guess, self-reflective as well as outward reflecting. I think it's important for practitioners, for all those involved in a mining project, to really take a critical look at our approach. If as industry, if as a practitioner, you're still writing impact assessments like you were writing them 10 years ago, then it's time to upgrade. And I think this is kind of what it simply refers to. Times are changing, people's expectations are changing, and I think it's important for us to take a critical look at whether we're still doing things how we were doing 10 years ago, or are we actually doing something different. This is, again, for both governments and industry, as well as for Indigenous representatives, is to take a critical look at your advisors. So in any large-scale project, there are typically a few advisors involved: political, social, environmental, and so on. I think it's important for all parties to take a critical look at what advice they're getting from the individuals. If the individuals you're working with who are advising you are giving you the same advice that they were giving you 20 years ago, then it might be time to take again a critical look at that. This is no surprise. Go beyond what's legally required. Focus on what's socially required. Taking the time to understand Indigenous worldview. If for any impact assessment practitioners in the room today, we've learned how to do impact assessment a certain way. If you're a real impact assessment nerd, you know of the Leopold matrix and so on. I think it's really important when we work with nations in Indigenous territories that we take the time to understand the Indigenous worldview and their construct of impacts and their how those impacts are conceptualized and realized. Understand how decisions are made in every nation in the territory, and this is really important because we worked with nations where they do have a chief and council elected under the Indian Act. However, they also have clan systems. The chief and council reports to the family heads who sit at a family table, and it's that family table that makes decisions. In other cases, it's a council of elders that solely makes the decision. In other cases, the elders are advisors to the matriarchs who make the decision. So for any practitioner, it's really important to take the time to understand how decisions are made and hence what the power structure, if you will, is. Bridging the gap between the professional and the personal. So this is something that I have been reflecting on a personal level quite a bit in the last little while, having spent a majority of the time advising nations, is decisions that are made in major projects affect people on very personal levels. And I think it's important to continually be mindful of that. And so, you know, as representatives in governments or as representatives in industry, or even as practitioners, it's important to be mindful of the weight of those decisions. So that is what I have. My contact information is here. I believe the webinar is being recorded, so Karen would be able to send out any information. And my last slide here is a gentle reminder to wash our hands. But on that note, Karen, I'll pass it on to you if we have time for questions or however we want to go from here. But thank you for listening, everyone.
All right, thank you. That was great. So I didn't see too many questions. There's a lot of little dialogue back and forth and comments being made in the chat. There were a couple specific questions that were in there. And if anybody has things they want to start adding into the chat right now, please do that while we start with these first couple ones. But Jan, maybe you would just like to come on line and unmute yourself. But you were asking about Section 35 of the Constitution. So maybe just, you can expand on that. Oh, wait, I can't hear you, so just.
Section 35, the interpretation of Section 35 of the Constitution explicitly says that it's not a veto right. And so indigenous concerns have to be taken into account, and they have to be reasonably taken into account and reasonably discussed, but they're not a veto, whereas many of the interpretations of FPIC are taking consent very literally, and they look like a veto. And so the FPIC and Section 35 are seem a little bit at contradiction. That was my feeling. Great. And I'm not 100% sure how that works through. I personally think that Section 35, if applied correctly and with the correct bias towards social justice, etc., will work and will help meet FPIC.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing those comments. And I'll offer that when I sit down around a fire and have a conversation with my Indigenous advisors, they say Section 35 is so archaic, and if we're going to keep Section 35 as our benchmark, then we're thinking 50 years ago as opposed to where the world wants us to go. That's one thought. The other one is we're at a crossroads in Canada in particular, where we have Indigenous legal orders and Indigenous understanding of law, and how Indigenous people have for time immemorial built their own systems of law as faced off with Canadian colonial law. And so I think it's going to be very difficult to argue one side of law against the other, because then we're having a purely legal conversation. And I love my lawyer friends, many of them good advisors to me as well. That said, legally the right thing to do may not be socially the right thing to do. And I think, law might say go here, but if society says go here, then sorry, the law isn't helping you anymore. So I think that's more, it's a rhetorical commentary more so than anything about the nature of practice. And I believe we have a moral obligation to go beyond the basic requirement of the law.
Thanks for those comments. And I fully agree with you. There has to be evolution. On the other hand, I did a study of the sort of Indigenous peoples and mining in Canada over the past 150 years, and Section 35 made a huge difference. Without Section 35, we would still be in the Stone Age. So it's a good starting point.
Okay, so the other first question I had, Gord, I see you popping in the chat off and on, but you had asked about how can consent be multi-staged and how can we make investment decisions. And so maybe you want to come on and have add a little bit more to that question, some background there.
I think I'm coming online.
Yeah, you're here.
Okay. Okay, put me on the spot. I guess I'm just referring to, look, all of these initiatives, particularly in resource development, are investments. And to make that investment, especially at the very early stages of exploration, or even a little bit further along where you're maybe working on a more advanced project and looking to advance it further, you just can't have question marks surrounding the project. You need to have, I'll say, consent at the very beginning. Otherwise, there's really no point in going forward, because we're in the one of the highest risk in industries in the world, both early stages and even operationally. So I just don't see a way forward if you don't have consent at the very beginning. But I'll leave it to other people to chime in with their comments and feedback.
Thank you, Gord. I see David raising his hand. So David, maybe we'll go to you and then I can weigh in.
Yeah, it isn't an answer, but it builds a little bit on Gord's closing comment on the staged approach and Somia, your just do it comment. Exactly. When we get into these large capital expenditure ventures, they're multi-decades often, right? Like I'm not going to drop hundreds of millions of dollars or billions of dollars in the case of our oil sands to hope that something might go my way for the next 5 or 10 years. One example, Gord, that comes to mind, and I think it fits with the just do it, is along these lines. I make a commitment to develop a resource, and I'm going to put the land back to a condition at least as good as I found it, maybe better. Okay. And when we look at that, we come back and we say, well, do you want exactly the same muskeg and the blueberry patches and the beaver access and everything? And when I go to ask the locals, especially in Fort McKay, they'll say, yes, but depending on the age group I'm asking, some say, actually, I wouldn't mind having a little place to go skidooing, maybe some motorbiking. And then someone else says, oh, but I want to be able to fish over here. And I go, well, you know, you never were able to fish before. Nobody was. The Athabasca River is 50 meters deeper than you are here. So it's an interesting thing. So one of the accommodations I'm looking at, so you take that as consultation, and it's tough to have the consent, as we've all been touching on here, because it's a multitude of views. You can't satisfy all the people all the time. But then I need to have certainty on my investment. So one mechanism, it's not an answer for everybody, it's just to say, listen, I know we're going to put closure to this site eventually, and I know it's going to cost me some money. And the coal industry did something by accruing certain liability amounts for future closure. The oil industry also does the same thing, whether it's on a unit of production basis or expected cost of closure. Point is, we've earmarked a quantum of funds that's affordable, quote unquote, for my investment. And it's interesting because one of the things that's emerging is saying, be adaptable. We know, just do it. We're going to develop. We're going to create employment. We're going to put closure back. And you know what? The closure that we're talking about on a specific hectarage is going to be 50 years from now. I don't know who's going to be around at the time. Clearly, the local indigenous people that were there for the first 5,000 years, their ancestors will still be there. But tastes and values and such may change. So what we do is we say, well, let's have the funds that are earmarked, and in the closure that comes around will be within that context. So if you will, the flexibility comes around with the setting expectations. Not to say it's a playground, but at the end it's like, here's $100 million in those years' terms in the 2050, let's say, pick the period that we look at closure. And we don't know what it's going to look like. We just know we made a commitment to make the people happy again because we borrowed the resources. We've enjoyed the benefits of those through royalties, etc. Hopefully, we reciprocated in some of that enjoyment through employment and what every individual can get from their employment. But to put the Mother Nature back, we're saying, okay, this is what we have earmarked. So don't let any. Basically, it's setting expectations. Is that reasonable? Now, some may say, well, I want to make sure with the end we have a lake. Maybe I want to make sure I have a hill. Maybe I want to make sure I have moose pasture, hunting, whatever. So it's not a perfect answer, Gord, but it's one way to mitigate that degree of uncertainty I have when I'm looking at an extremely large financial investment, right? So I said, I want to get going with it, just do it. But I also want to make sure that everyone understands I'm not going to leave a mess behind, and I'm actually putting some money where my mouth is. So, and I put all this in the first person, but of course I'm semi-retired now, so I only help from an environmental perspective. I no longer are out there moving the shovels and the men and the women and the drills and everything anymore, and no longer sitting down with Chief Boucher, who's now been replaced by Mel Grajam. But anyway, just my 2 cents. It can be done.
Thank you. Karen, how are we doing for time? Oh.
Keep forgetting I'm muted. Yeah, it's 11 o'clock right now. So we are at the top of the hour, but we can carry on if people are wanting to have some more conversation. I see another hand raised here, Henry. There are a couple other questions in the chat as well.
Maybe if I could comment on Gord's question and then David's comments as well, yeah. Henry, before you jump in. So one comment I have, Gord, on the investment piece in particular is investment is a tricky thing because financially speaking, investment has to be, the investor has to be comfortable with what they're putting their money in. The company may not be the investor, so you might have an outside entity or a series of entities or banks who are supporting that investment. And so it's important to be mindful of that investment model on which those risks are being hinged upon. And my expectation is that over time, we'll start to see more flexibility in investors based on how this landscape is evolving across Canada. But pure speculation, things might be a little bit different in reality as FPIC gains or UNDRIP gains more understanding across the country. Henry, I'll go to you now. Thank you.
Okay, you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. David was talking about the risk of his investment. And a few years ago, I was following the development of Osisko, a gold mine in Quebec. And at the beginning of the project, they had received support from the government, about 40% of their risk. Some of you have experience about what is the public investment in the first period of exploration where there is no obligation for the company to give any information about the financing, but they receive a certain proportion of their financial risk. Is that, I think for me, it looked that 40% is quite a big amount without having any responsibility or possibility to ask information because it is under the private investment, but in reality, it's 40% public. So it is for me something amazing. I did ask already the question to the president, Mr. Rosen, at a conference somewhere, but I had the finance person responsible who came right to me and say, I give you my my address and a card and I will answer you, but I never had information about that. And I think it's only, I would like to, if some of you can give me a certain rationale about the real percentage of public money invested in the mine sector, for example.
Does anyone want to take that on?
Sorry about that.
I have a question. When you say investment of the public sector in the mining sector, what kind of things would you include? I spent much time working for geological surveys. Would you call that an investment in the mining industry?
No.
Okay, thanks.
At the beginning of the project, there was rising money, and to help this company, private company, to develop the project. Government, different kind of subsidies, but it roughly come to 40% of the investment needed. And I think it's a significant help without having anything to say in the project.
Yeah. So maybe just a quick response. I see Quinn. Sean?
Yeah, Stephen.
Yes.
Yeah. So,
okay.
I can comment, on two different aspects. I've raised $1 billion for the mining sector in the last 40 years, zero, which has come from government. Quebec is very, very unusual. Quebec has its unique setup of its pension plans, which proactively invest in mining investments. And I'm aware of several companies, whether it's a Cisco, Stornoway, different companies like that, where the Quebec pension plans have, become direct investors to help assets move forward, whether it's the case or other organizations like that. And they often have been significant contributors. But, Quebec is almost unique, certainly in the Americas. It's very, very rare to see state money going into mining projects. Probably the unique example in BC I would point to is the Highway 37 power line, which was built to facilitate access both to hydropower and to mining. And the government put that money in, which allowed the Red Chris mine to develop and tap into that power line, which it wouldn't have been able to go ahead without that power line. But that power line was much more driven by the economics of accessing hydropower, for stranded hydro, than it was related to the mining side. The mining was sort of, the icing on the cake, if you want to call it that.
Oh, sorry, I had muted you, Henry, but.
Just a little correction between the difference between OSISCO and Stornoway for diamond. Stornoway were a government official participation, which is correct, right, but not for OSISCO.
Yeah. But they did have the pension plans, as opposed to official government participation. The Quebec pension plans were major investors in the Cisco, and they continue in 02 and 03, both major shareholders of the spin-off 02 and 03 companies. They're 20-30% shareholders of those companies.
Okay,
we have, I'm just looking at the group chat here, and sorry, I haven't been following it too closely, but a great idea from Glenn White to speak to economic participation ownership in a project is a key aspect to the path to achieving consent. And absolutely, I think that would make for a really good topic. We're seeing significant equity partnership, economic partnerships going far beyond simply employment and set-asides, if you will, as a mechanism for building economies. For one of my clients from Treaty 3, they keep emphasizing the importance of building regional economies that is core to the Manitowoc-Kinaquanigawen, which is the Anishinaabe Resource Law. So it would make for a really interesting topic.
Okay. So I did see a question in here from David Clary regarding how does industry and Indigenous participants engage in balancing sort of the UNDRIP?
Do you want me to?
Yeah, maybe you can.
Yeah, well, no, I was thinking because the framing of UNDRIP certainly in ILO 169, framing of FPIC in ILO 169, and I think to some extent in UNDRIP, it explicitly recognizes that FPIC and the need for FPIC is one of a government's responsibilities, but then it also has a broader responsibility to the overall population. And so it raises circumstances in which the government may proceed without FPIC. And I'm interested in, thoughts on sort of how do industry and Indigenous communities kind of engage with that understanding as well, that there is a a broader authority to put FPIC in the perspective of overall decision making, rather than FPIC being the complete determinant of a government's decision.
Sorry, I can't see Somia. All of a sudden she has disappeared, I think.
It's a tough question, David.
Yeah.
Well, we have to deal with the tough questions.
Yeah.
As usual.
Does anyone want to pipe up and chat? I'm just going to check on what happened with Somia here.
I'm not sure it's a particularly answerable question, but I think it's a context that we need to be discussing FPIC in. It's not something in complete isolation. And I can't remember exactly the ILO 169 wording, but it recognizes that the government has a broader obligation as well.
Janice, I saw you had a few things noted in the comments. Maybe you want to bring up some thoughts around some ways of working. Yes, no?
Oh, well, like I say, I was just thinking about it from a complex adaptive system approach, where, as we're essentially talking about, there's a lot of interdependencies, the financial, social, environmental side, workforce. And those are all very dynamical. And you know, if we think about complex adaptive systems, one metaphor that I use is, just wanted to share, is that, yeah, that we're getting hung up on context. And I like, because what if that is what emerges? And like a balloon, and like the interior of a balloon that causes the lift, that's the lift, or that is defined by the edges of what goes into the free, the prior, and the informed. But that takes a different method of evaluation and than we traditionally do. And if we can change our focus a little bit around to those, the metaphor is very similar to when we think about discovery or what makes a mineral deposit. There's many different opinions on what that is. And as we gather more and more information, advancing projects, those edges become more clearer to us, or we learn ways of monitoring those edges as we gather more information about them. And that's a little bit about risk as well, in terms of there's always a margin of maneuver around those edges in a balloon in terms of what will make it collapse or what not, and the pace of change in evaluating those. So in a way, that metaphor and that approach of a system can allow us to think of new ways of evaluating continuously, and also coming up with approaches to, there's ways of actually mapping those states, both in projects and through narratives as well, where it becomes visual maps, much like we do in mineral exploration. And then those can help inform where are those potential fractures emerging, and it's a continuous state. And you talked about multi-layers, different scales as well, that does apply. But it takes a shift in thinking from something linear and to these interconnections and interdependencies, and a different way of evaluating and monitoring. And that actual approach aligns as well more with a lot of the indigenous ways, which can make it easier. But different governments are using these types of approaches now to inform policy in different environments and approaches of doing. So we say just do, but there actually are different types of strategies and ways of doing things that can help if you think of it as a complex adaptive system.
Perfect. I see Doug has his hand up, and I'm just going to say we're going to try and wrap up in the next 5 or 10 here, just to let everyone go. But please speak up, Doug.
Thank you, Karen. I just wanted to pick up on the comments just made and some earlier about the idea of investors needing certainty and the struggle some of the comments have had with the idea of a multi-staged process to achieve FPIC. And it's always struck me as a bit odd that thinking of the more, if I can call it that, historically conventional aspects of assessing a mineral project being the geology and then the technical economic dimensions, once you get a certain amount of proven probable reserves established through and National Instrument 43-101, and that is the basis on which you go and make an investment decision for the geological part of it, you don't get a guarantee handed to you that 6 months from now, factors that lead into how many of the resources are put into those categories are going to remain there. It's a dynamic process, and reserves can shrink as well as grow with ongoing geology. We can find, as some cases have proven, that our interpretation of an ore body was just wrong, and there's actually, the reserves are 1/3 of what we thought. And likewise, the same comment could be made for the supposedly, or well, largely scientific and technical aspects of economic and technical review of a project. Factors can change, including unrelated to a project. A sort of replacement mineral commodity can have an improvement in cost or technology that has an effect on how we assess a project. So you don't get guarantees in any, however scientific it seems, we're always subject to the risk of things changing. So the idea that we have trouble with not getting a guarantee handed to us that having achieved a certain amount of social license or FPIC at one stage, that is now we can put it in our back pocket and never look back. It's always seemed a bit strange to me, and I like the kind of comments Sonia made about just focusing more on the process and trusting that if we do that right, the outcome will be positive, rather than saying before we invest our money, we need to know for certain that you're not going to change your minds or have a problem with what we do. So I just wanted to, I think some of the comments throughout have highlighted the fact that we shouldn't maybe be as intimidated by the idea of it being stage-wise and subject to needing continuous work.
Thank you, Doug. I appreciate that, and reflecting on the interviews that I did as a part of this research, when I brought up this question of multi-stage certainty that industry is looking for specifically for investments, the general response that I got from Indigenous leadership was, what's the big deal? Industry changes their mind, which is, kind of the factors that you've referred to all the time. One day something is feasible, the next day the metal prices drop and it's no longer feasible. So there are all these other factors that the investment industry, as well as practitioners and everybody around, is really comfortable with, except for this particular one. So I think, that fear of uncertainty that comes from this one, I think, is something that we really do need to take a hard look at and be comfortable with the idea that it's just like any of the other factors. It's a process that needs to be worked through with certain principles. So thank you for sharing.
Can I make an industry perspective comment on that? One of the things that we work to distinguish is between certainty of outcome and certainty of process. And there's certainly a lot of uncertainties around what unfolds. I think people who make investments into things look for, do they understand the risks, and do they understand, in a sense, what the uncertainties are and what they aren't. And I think part of the uncertainty comment and the difficulty in the idea of, and I think it's particularly the veto idea, is that it introduces a risk and a decision process that is subject to redefinition constantly through the project. And so I think it's not that people are looking for certainty of outcome, but they're looking for clarity of process and clarity of criteria, I think is a better way to look at it.
Absolutely. And, you know, one of the things that would be naive to not acknowledge is people are unpredictable. And I think there's always uncertainty associated with, more uncertainty associated with processes that entail people and how people will respond to certain things. So I completely agree with the comments about that distinction from an industry's perspective.
All right. So I think we've come to the end of the official questions that were on the roster, and it is close to 11:30 here. I don't know what time everybody else has, but we've been on for an hour and a half. So I think I'll take this time to thank Somia for her presentation and for all of this participation and discussion we've all had. It's been a really great webinar, and I hope everyone has a great Easter weekend. Stay safe out there, keep washing your hands, social distancing, and let's get through this pandemic quickly. You want to come online and say goodbye? That's great.
Yeah. Goodbye, everyone. Have a great weekend.
Everybody, thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank
you.
Hey, thanks.
Thanks. Thank you.
Happy Easter.
Take care.
Bye,
Bye-bye.
everyone. Have a great Easter.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.